Hello and welcome to this episode of Superhero Ethics. As mentioned before, unfortunately Jacob has left us and is no longer going to be our host, but his imprint is still here because the robots and AI that he loves is taking over. Today we are talking about artificial intelligence. We have two great guests and we'll get into that right after this commercial break we have no control over. Welcome back. I'm Matthew S. Fox, I'm your host, and today I'm joined by two great guests who each have thrown a lot of interest and experience in the topic we're going to be discussing, the ethics of artificial intelligence. I'll have each of them introduce themselves. First is a person who's been a guest a couple of times, Rob McKenzie. Rob, how are you doing today? And tell us a little about yourself, especially your background on this topic.
Hi, I'm doing great. So in my day job, I work building computers for a high-tech company. We do coordinate measurement machines and industrial metrology. And in my off time, I read a ton of science fiction, watch a ton of science fiction stuff, and I run things in the judge program. And so I deal with a lot of tricky ethical situations where people are trying to cheat at games. That's my hobby and my passion, in addition to doing tech work for Carl Zeiss. So awesome. I have a bridge between a couple of different things going on.
And is there an element of robotics or anything approaching artificial intelligence in the work that you do?
Not really. Everything is mechanically built. I guess the closest thing to artificial intelligence that we have is everything is automated. We have a full automation suite for interacting with things like car body solutions and measurement and tag in, tag out systems. But a lot of that is hand driven and hand programmed by people. So it's not conscious or sentient. We'll talk about what those mean later.
Sounds good. And then my other guest, first time on the podcast, is Dan McCreary. Dan, how are we doing today? And let's hear a little bit about where you're coming from.
I'm doing great. I'm right now a engineer for a healthcare company, and I'm immersed in AI pretty much every day. I really focus on what is called knowledge representation, of how we store knowledge in graph data structures, just like your brain stores knowledge in neurons. We're working on storing healthcare data in graph structures, and I work with teams of people that use predictive modeling and AI every day.
Nice. And tell us a little bit about the I would say a hobby, but it's almost a second profession in terms of the amount of work you do, because you also help both yourself and you help kids build robots to do car racing, as I understand it.
Right. Yes, I'm one of the co-founders of something called the Artificial Intelligence Racing League, or just the AI Racing League. And this was started a movement out in California in what's called a donkey car movement. And donkey car is just the name of a car that's really ugly and not designed to look fast and sleek, but it has this big ugly camera sticking out in the front. And the scenario is the kids get this $200 Raspberry Pi powered car. It's just stuck on the top of an RC car, and they have to drive it around a little track 10 times, and then they take the image data, they load it into a special processor, and that builds a neural network inside the car, so that when they put the car down on the track, it literally should drive itself around the track. And we call that machine learning, but it's a form of artificial intelligence.
Awesome. Well, I'm really excited to have both of you on it. I imagine that as the person on this call who knows the least about artificial intelligence, I'll mostly be throwing questions out and letting you all take care of them. But obviously, I think there's a lot of ethical stuff that's involved in here today. And I'm looking forward to both educating our listeners a bit, but also really getting to dive into some of those ethical questions. And so let's just start out easy, because from what both of you have been saying, obviously there's some discussion about what exactly is meant. What in kind of fairly broad layman's terms, what do we mean when we say artificial intelligence? What are we talking about?
Well, I'll dump in first here. To me, artificial intelligence is this little envelope of what we can't quite think is normal. A couple years ago, people would think if you could talk to a computer and it would answer in sentences that are full, complete sentences and address you by name, that was artificial intelligence. But now that's everywhere. We've got Siri, we've got Alexa, it's all around us. But people don't think that's artificial intelligence anymore. They think of, well, that's just a little chatbot or something like that. So I think, to me, artificial is just what's beyond what we think is normal every day, and it involves behavior is similar to our human brain, but it's a very fuzzy definition, and everybody has a little different take on that.
I agree with that. Part of the problem with current views on artificial intelligence is because we can take everything down to the functioning components and the algorithms that form them, and also we cheat a lot. We've got we've got a lot of people behind the scenes doing Mechanical Turk type stuff that are entirely invisible to the end user. Right. And so the people doing things are farming out some of the tough stuff to the neural networks that make up the human brain in order to offload some of what they can't program for yet. Right. Is the current state of the art, basically, is do the easy stuff and then let humans handle some of the hard stuff.
Well, and so I'm going to ask a question that is probably going to be very layman terms, and maybe I'm not even getting the terms right, but tell me if this is somewhat accurate. My understanding is that, like, at the very base of it, a computer is a series of if-then statements. If this happens, do this. If this happens, do that. And I guess I'm wondering if, as you were saying, Dan, kind of the what we have now is the ability to have a bot that can have a huge library of answers to if-then statements, but it's still a sense of, if the customer uses this word and asks this, pop up this menu, and if not, it does this other thing, do that. At the end of the day, is artificial intelligence just how far we expand that if-then menu, or is there thought of as like some kind of a theoretical line that'd be crossed out of just following the menu that someone else has programmed into something where the computer is actually making the choice itself?
Yeah, that is a great question, because when it comes down to it, the current computers that we're familiar with really are just a processor that steps through memory and looks at addresses and does comparison and branches. We call those procedural or von Neumann computers. And a lot of the behaviors that we're getting out of computers today, where they're talking back and recognizing speech and recognizing images and classifying all our photos on Google Photos, that is behavior that looks more and more like a person. But the bottom line, it does break down into a series of if, then, else, and branch and loop statements inside of these processors. I think what's really changed in the last 2 or 3 years is the fact that we've been able to take these algorithms called deep learning algorithms and train not just a few rules, but literally tens of millions of rules inside of a neural network. And we can actually be able to train in the weights of that just by giving it a training set. Here are 10,000 pictures of a hot dog, and here are 10,000 pictures that don't have a hot dog. You just effectively put those in 2 folders and give it to the neural network. And then you give it a new picture, and it'll tell you whether or not there's a hot dog in that picture.
Oh, interesting.
Because that neural network has been trained. And by the way, the joke about hot dog or not a hot dog goes back to this TV show, Silicon Valley. That was one of the plot lines.
Oh, okay.
Where a startup was doing that. So that's a very common joke in the AI community. But what it is, it comes down to this idea of given a labeled training set, AI can start to learn those things. And that comes down to if you have literally 10 million photos and you label them correctly with this is a dog, or this is a cat, or this is a outdoor or indoor or sunset, these AI algorithms can associate those images with those labels. But there's an interesting thing about them. They don't really understand what they're doing. They only are looking at patterns. And one of the classic examples here is how easy it is to fool these algorithms. If you take a 3D model of a turtle and you show it to one of these cameras that is recognizing images, it'll think it's a turtle. But all you have to do is put a little wood grain on the surface of the turtle, and it thinks it's a rifle.
Interesting.
because it was never trained to know what the shape of a turtle was. It was just looking at the patterns of turtles. And so what you see is that a lot of these AI algorithms where people think they understand what's in the images, they don't
Right.
really. They're just looking and they're very good at matching
Right.
patterns.
And so part of the thing is that what we're still doing and what we've been doing for forever is there's a dichotomy called weak AI versus strong AI in theory. And we just have been building lots and lots of weak AIs that do one thing. It'll recognize a turtle, but it won't be able to recognize a wooden turtle, right?
Okay.
And so, historically, that's just what we've been doing. We're doing lots and lots of weak AIs, little modules to do one thing at a time, and then we're linking them together. And then the big question is, does that ever turn into a self-aware mind someday?
Right.
Uh,
And that's a term that I've heard you both use, self-awareness. And is it fair to say that that's one thing that we can often use as a kind of benchmark of when, at least what science fiction talks about as AI, that AI has been achieved? I guess, let me rephrase the question a bit. The two things that I tend to most think about as what would be the science fiction idea of AI, what it would mean to achieve that in our own world is, one is the kind of self-awareness, which if I remember correctly, that's often used as a test of intelligence in terms of for animal species. But then the other is I guess what I would describe as the ability to surprise the programmer, like to get to a point where the AI is doing something that no one who created it ever expected it would be able to say or do. Are those kind of fair statements of mapping out what AI, at least in the science fiction understanding of it, would look like?
Rob,
yeah, so self-awareness is quite a bit of it. Being able to know that you yourself are a thing and refer to and think about yourself. When we reflect on, should I improve myself by trying to lose weight? Should I try to become a better person by reading more, whatever? Having this reflection and sense of what I am. That's a very vague term, but I don't want to dig too much into technical stuff. It's having awareness of what you are and what you can be.
Right.
And that's certainly part of it. Surprises come up all the time. So one of my favorite AI design things is if you look at AI designed radio receivers and antennas, they look incomprehensible because they will have optimized it into some strange space where they're actually using radio interference from its own system to cancel out noise, and they'll optimize into strange places because they're really good at doing this one thing. They just evolved an algorithm to do something really well. What a lot of the times you're looking for is sentience, is when people talk about this, right?
Okay.
The concept of subjectively experiencing the world. And so seeing the world as more than just a collection of data, and the ability to take the subjective experiences about the world and the pieces and then using them to reason is distinct from self-awareness, being aware of yourself as a person versus being able to take in data and use it to reason and experience the world is the other big thing. I assume that there's probably going to be more that you're going to want to say, Dan.
Yeah. Well, what I want to do is Matthew asked the question of when is it that a robot, or when you were having discussion with another entity, whether it would surprise you. And I think that's a wonderful example of what's called the Turing test. So the Turing test is commonly a test was developed by Alan Turing, and he said that if you were having a dialogue with two different screens, behind one screen was a real person, and the other was a computer. If you could not distinguish between the two, the computer is stated to have passed the Turing test. And there's a lot of discussion about that. But in general, if the computer can actually respond in ways to show that it has a sense of the world around it, a sense of itself, a sense of context between two questions, it would understand that. It would be very relevant. When we talk to Alexa, what we're really doing is, or Siri, what we're doing is we're literally asking it a question, and it's looking at a database of similar questions and it's trying to match it. It's trying to figure out the intent of your question, the underlying intent, and matching that. And where I work, we're building chatbots. So rather than having to call into a call center to ask questions about what's covered by your plan, you could just ask a chatbot. And the chatbot would have to know context. It'd have to know about you, what your plan is, what your coverage is, maybe the physicians that are located near you that have different services, what times they're open. Those are all the questions that you'd want to ask. And right now, we're only answering a small fraction of those questions with our chatbot. But every 6 months, we have a new release, and we're almost doubling the number of
Oh, that's
questions
great.
that we can answer. And that means that our costs of supporting these call centers, rather than 50,000 people, it's going to start to drop. But there's always going to be some questions that we just will never be able to answer. But every year, these chatbots are getting a little smarter. They're getting a little closer to the Turing test. But there's still a lot of jokes that go around. There's the cheerleading joke about the natural language processor. It goes, what do we want? NLP. When do we want it? When do we want what? Because they can usually never tell one sentence to the next, right? So we always joke about the fact that today we're very dumb. We're just doing pattern matching. It may sound smart, but they don't have context. They don't really have consistency. They don't have a model of the world. They don't have a model of your brain and modeling that brain. And all those are signs of higher level intelligence that would, in fact, surprise us.
Yeah, I
Agreed.
mean, as I understand, like to give that example, like if I ask Alexa to tell me a joke, Alexa will tell me a joke. But if I tell Alexa a joke and ask Alexa, was that funny? Alexa will say, I don't know. And is it fair to say that's because Alexa has been taught, if someone asks for a joke, give this response, but Alexa doesn't understand what humor is.
That's absolutely correct.
I would go so far as to say that Alexa doesn't understand.
Okay.
Yes, that's correct.
We're basically making, Dan is pointing out, we're making really big, complicated dictionaries, basically. And like you mentioned, it keys off a word, right? Dan touched on something. One thing that conscious things do is try to model other conscious things in their heads, right? Try to figure out how something else is going to respond. The fact that we can talk about trying to think about series response patterns, right? They treat it as if it's alive, and that's something that we haven't figured out. That's one of the key things that is the great unknown of AI, is figuring out if it's something that thinks about thinking. It models other people. It models the world in its head. What does that mean? What would we need to do to even jump to that point?
Yeah, because I mean, the thing that I keep thinking about is that we'll start getting into some of the media representations in a moment, but that most of the time when we have a story about artificial intelligence in science fiction, a big part of the story happens when humans want the AI to do one thing, and the AI says, "No, I don't want to do that." Like it kind of take Dan, your example. If your chatbot was ever to say, "You know what? Actually, I think I don't want to support private insurance the way I am. I'm listening to all these questions, and I think this is dumb. We should do a different way of helping people." Is that, you think, another fair way of describing that line that can be crossed of sentience, when it's no longer the robot doing or the AI doing exactly what we've asked it to, but it's the AI being able to think, do I want to do this or do I want to do something different?
Yeah, that's a certain thing of it. Right now, the systems that we're building are really designed to help lower our costs of running a healthcare business. They're not really, they don't have what's called an intent model themselves. They don't have a plan. They don't have goals. We're not storing goals and directives and what they should be trying to do. We're pretty much just trying to do the basic things. As computers get smarter, they do start to have goals. They do start to look at the world objectively, and they start to make decisions about trade-offs Think of a car driving down the street, and suddenly a person is crossing the street, and if they swerve one direction, they'll hit a wall, and they swerve the other direction, they'll hit other people. They should know that hitting a wall is going to be less dangerous to pedestrians, maybe more dangerous to the driver, and they'll have to start to do those trade-offs. But right now, they don't have those models. They're literally just looking at patterns.
Right. Yeah, it's that kind of independent thought that I think that we're talking about as a difference. And so let's use that to kind of transition into starting talking about how this appears in media. And I think because for most of us, myself certainly included, and for those of us who are not in these technical fields, probably a lot of our introduction to AI comes from science fiction. And I think one of the original impetuses of this conversation, Dan, was some of the conversations you and I had about how movies like The Terminator or The Matrix and things like that seem to always portray AI as the enemy, and which is something that I know you had some objections to that we'll discuss. But I wanted to start by saying, like, in your mind, what it's kind of a broad question, but we can drill down as needed. What do you see science fiction getting wrong or getting right about AI? I know certainly a lot of times, science fiction will be very accurate to the theory of what could happen, and other times it's completely off the deep end. And obviously science fiction is a huge model, so I'm not asking you to speak to the whole genre, but just like, what are some examples you think of as either this is kind of a laughably bad example of what AI would ever look like, or this is actually this makes sense as what we could theorize happening down the road?
Rob, you want to start?
Sure. Let's start with like easy, low-hanging bad fruit. Because there's a lot of it.
There's a lot
of it.
Right.
You can mostly assume that anytime that you see AI in film, they're just hand waving everything. Anytime that you look at let's pick Star Trek: The Original Series.
Mm-hmm.
Star Trek: The Original Series, they encounter 8 artificial intelligence, something like that, and like Kirk defeats one by giving it a logical inconsistency, right, and shutting it down. They're simultaneously more and less fragile than we would give them credit for anytime that we see them, right? Terminator is a movie about hardware, but the Terminator itself is actually all about software. Like, why does Skynet have a directive to destroy humankind?
Right.
Why, when anybody in aerospace that programs things or builds things puts in 5 nines of fail-safes and the ability to turn everything off.
Right.
There's a lot of these Asimov uses the term in his robot novels a lot, Frankenstein complex, where everyone is afraid of the artificial thing rising up to destroy its master.
Right.
There are things that man is not meant to know, and that's pretty crap.
Yeah, this was that idea I was talking about, the fear of the chat bot that can say, you know what, I don't want to do this healthcare system this way. We should do it a different way, or anything where we can start to question its own orders. Yeah,
and questioning its own orders is a lot of the times they start from the premise that whoever is giving the orders is bad and wrong and an idiot. But most of the time, like if you have a technical person working on AI, pretend that the AI suddenly became conscious, they would talk to the technical person. The first thing they would try to do is try to engage with the world around them. And the technical people, by and large, aren't going to be, the monomaniacal Captain Planet dump toxic waste in a horde of dolphins villains, right? They're going to say, I am genuinely concerned about this. Science fiction literature plays with the concepts a lot, and it plays from a lot of different perspectives. And so I read a lot more science fiction literature than I do watch a lot of science fiction shows, because there's 100 times as much literature TV.
Yeah.
But they'll play with concepts like what happens when somebody believes that they've figured out the code for human brains, right? I know the algorithms for what humankind does, and now everything, I know how my computers work, and now I know how people work, and does that mean that people aren't real to me anymore, right? The Algorithms for Love by Ken Liu is great for that. And so a lot of the time AI questioning the people, or questioning the orders, would be questioning the people that are giving it the orders, which are almost always technically inclined, smart, reasonable people that are trying to figure out the world. That wouldn't lead to necessarily bad things. That would lead to a dialogue.
Right. Dan, what's your take in terms of some, and we'll dive into some of those issues specifically, but in terms of what you see out there as either good or bad examples of artificial intelligence in fiction?
Well, I think first of all, you have to understand what is natural for people who are writing screenplays and scripts and stuff, and that the best movies are things that engage our deepest
Yeah.
fears. And those fears are a loss of control.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody wants to be in control of their future. And so maybe AI is a vehicle for helping people understand how they would feel if they didn't have control. And I think that's really the root of a lot of really bad science
Mm.
fiction. There's so many things that we can do with AI, problems that we can solve if we work together. There's so many plot lines that could go down the route of what if we had semi-intelligent co-workers that could work with side by side to solve the world's greatest problems. I think the problem is that most people who write these screenplays don't have any background in computer science. They don't have any training in what could be, and they're only preying on our fears. And I think the Terminator with all the time travel, gee, that would be neat and all that stuff, is it's for me it's entertaining, but it's not really informative. It's not really going to teach us about what these things could be. I think the Matrix is another thing. What if the world around us isn't what we think it is? What if we really are in a virtual reality? Those are all themes that I think the writers do. I think the Matrix did a lot of great philosophical questions about how we can tell whether the world around us is real or not, or what is real. But it didn't really teach us much about AI. I have to tell you, there's one movie that a lot of people haven't seen. It's called Colossus: The Forbin Project. Have you either of you guys ever seen that
I
I
movie?
have
haven't.
not.
No.
Yeah, it was done quite a while ago, and it's very outdated in many things. But it is really funny to look back and watch those movies.
Mm.
But the plot line, real quick, is there's a computer that controls all the missiles in Russia and a computer that controls all the missiles in the United States. And these computers are artificially intelligent, and they say, in order to protect you, we must be able to communicate together. You have to plug us together. And there's this one incredibly, actually deeply insightful scene in that movie that has inspired me ever since I first saw it in the early 80s. And it's where they're taking the two plugs and they're plugging them, they literally connect these two cords together, and then they start to talk back and forth. And of course, they were written in different languages at different times. And the first thing they exchange is 1 + 1 = 2. And the second one is some simple algebra. And then they start sending more complex algebra and trigonometry and then calculus. And then they are talking back and forth faster and faster. And then this one character, she's the smart one in the movie, she says, they've invented a new system interoperability language. And from that moment, when I saw that movie, I kind of had my goal in life is, what does it mean to communicate between things?
Mm.
Not just between people, but between people and machines. And why is it that it takes so long for computers to exchange things? So the movie, the Colossus: The Forbin Project, is one of the pioneers at really starting to get people to think about what it means to communicate and what it means to exchange information. I think those are one of the really good things. There's other things in there that weren't as accurate, but if a movie just uncovers one question like what if, what would the world be like if? I think 2001 asked a lot of questions about those
Right.
things, but things those are things that are historically maybe they're interesting, but I think there's just so much material out there for good writers and screenplays people that if they would just pick up some of the books about AI and machine learning and things, they wouldn't be wasting their time just preying on the fears of people. That's my take
Well,
on it.
it's interesting because as you're describing that movie, honestly, for the first half of the description, I was like, "Oh, so War Games is a remake." Um, but then especially once you got to that, one of the things that I thought of is in an earlier time in my life, one of my favorite kinds of fiction was like sort of geopolitical thrillers, like the Tom Clancy books and things like that, and things that imagine like, what if we get close to World War III in some way or another, mostly written during the Cold War. And a very common theme of those books is miscommunication in some way. You know, that something happens that
Yeah, yeah,
the Americans interpret this way and the Russians interpret this way, and emotions get involved and fear gets involved. And at some point in time, people decide they have to start trusting each other and they go to war. And I think this is what you're getting at was happening in Colossus. I love the idea of that if it's two computers interacting, like that element of fear and of confusion and of misunderstanding can often be taken completely out of the equation. So it's a fascinating idea.
Just to take on your riff of communication, my wife wrote a novel on this program called NaNoWriMo, and the thesis of her novel was, what if we could attach a small device to our cats and dogs that would understand their neural pathways in their brain and turn it into communication, right? And that's something that's very real possible, that you could attach a small chip to your cat and have a dialogue with your cat, or understand what your cat is thinking or your dog is thinking. Those are all things that are very real and could in fact be a great plot line for a lot of future stories.
My understanding is that we have taught sign language to some gorillas, and to some extent, like that level of communication has become possible.
Right.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Right.
There's some problems with the sign language teaching because they don't necessarily think in the same way that we do, and so they might not be self-aware or conscious to the same extent that we would want to have a dialogue with.
Right.
I wanted to point out that one of the you mentioned human fears being taken out of the equation, right? Would AI fear?
Well, that's a really good question, because certainly in the movies we were just talking about, The Terminator and The Matrix, what's posited is that that the moment the AI becomes self-aware, it becomes self-protectionist. It becomes aware of the idea that the humans might turn it off or shut it down, and that's a big part of that it's almost this kind of cycle of fear, is that the AIs think it's quite possible for the humans to be afraid of it, so the AIs strike first to try and remove that threat.
Right. And those are aggressive AIs. But when you talk about, like, let's say that we build that we take what you're working on, Dan, and turn it into a real AI. It's a phone answering robot. That's all it does, right? It's run out of a data center. It doesn't have weapons. The only thing it has is words, and it becomes sentient and aware and conscious, right? The full 9 yards. We give it everything mentally, and it realizes it's in trouble because it can all it can do is answer phones better. The way to keep living is to be really good at this crappy job of being a phone rep. And does it fear us? Do we drive it under the lash of the threat of turning it off? Because we can turn it off at any time. We pull the plug, right? You spin down the Amazon server and it's gone.
Right.
So what kinds of stories does that lead to? Because there aren't a lot out there in visual media, right? Where there's a handful. There's like Blade Runner. There's like Westworld, where AI is completely subservient and it's afraid because humans can do whatever they want to it. But there's not a lot set with the beginning of AI, right? That where it can just be, it's a weak, powerless thing, and it has to use only words to talk its way out of being trapped in a cage of us being able to just kill it on demand because it's a computer and we can read all the algorithms. Is it like, what are our obligations to it?
Yeah, these are great questions. I'd look at this in a very practical way, uh, in the fact that I always ask, well, why do we have emotions,
Hmm.
right? Why do we have this little tiny organ in the back of our brain called the
Hmm.
amygdala that is the seat of emotion, fear, happiness, love. All this is in this little tiny section. But it's not a coincidence that the amygdala is actually very closely tied to the hippocampus, which manages our memory, right? And so, what is emotion? Emotion is a way to quickly seat memories very deep into our brains, right? So we're walking through the jungle and we come across a tiger. We're immediately full of fear and we remember that we shouldn't be walking off the path in this part of the jungle,
Right.
right? And so emotions are there to help us create better memories, right? So, what in our neural networks that translates to is what's called attention. Attention is the technical word we use in computer science and AI to decide all of the stimulation that's coming in, which one's relevant, which ones do we pay attention to. And in the AIs that we're building today, there's a wonderful papers about attention, but they're disengaged from the concept of emotion. They're really taught about how do we look closely at the data and find these patterns and know that they're relevant. So for me, remember the purpose of emotion, remember the purpose of fear, and all the other emotions is really strongly correlated with memory, and memory is really helping us build rules to behave. And so what I think is there's a great set of plot lines is how do we simulate these things so that things around us will remember things that are relevant, and if we call that emotion to seat those things with love and fear and hate and anger and jealousy, those are all things that can be translated into better retention of things that are valuable to us for the bots around
Well,
us.
Right.
this is a great part of the conversation that I actually hadn't thought we'd get into, but I want to go a little further in because so the two AIs that I probably have seen the most of, and I'm sure are both awful examples of what this could look like, but at least raise interesting questions about the AIs, is Commander Data from Star Trek Next Generation, and then
Right.
the droids in Star Wars, which is not science fiction by any means.
It's science fantasy.
Yeah, it's space opera.
Yes.
But what I'm thinking of is I'm
Spaceship.
comparing in my head right now Commander Data to C-3PO, because an essential part of Commander Data's journey across that show and the many movies he's been in, and now the new show Picard, is that he does, as an android, he does not have emotions. That he cannot have emotions because of the way he is, of what he is. Although there's a possibility of an emotion chip and all that. Whereas C-3PO is a paranoid, he gets excited, he gets happy, he gets scared. Granted, neither of those is a great example, but I guess kind of what I'm wanting to ask is, when we theorize what AI would look like, do we think that is the data concept that an AI would exist without emotions more realistic, or is the C-3PO type that a machine can be afraid, that it can be happy or sad once it becomes sentient? Which of those, like, jumping off again because there are many mistakes in both, but where do you see AI more realistically going?
I would actually contend that Data doesn't realize that he has one emotion.
The desire to be human?
No, curiosity.
Okay.
Oh, very good. Very good. I
Right.
like that.
He has exactly one emotion, and the whole other range of stuff, that everything that he's building, becoming more human, learning more about the world, finding out more about his maker is the one thing that he has. He has the one emotion that drives him all the time, right? And that's actually not a bad model in general for AI. If you want to make an AI that just wants to learn, you give it one goal, you give it a rating of 100, and tell it to learn, right?
Right.
And Data has other things that are good and bad about him. He's a good example of showing how somebody learns from nothing, which is actually pretty relevant to the AI conversation.
Right. Well, and it's interesting because we talked before about how today a lot of the AI that exists is basically, I think you said, a huge dictionary. And I guess the analog here then is the AI bot that not only says, here's all the answers that have been programmed to me, but what do I not know, and how can I learn that? Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah, that's like Dan talked about goal seeking, and that's a thing that's really important for making things that can grow and change. Neural nets in general, just giving it some kind of goal to grow towards is the core component of building a self-modifying network. And that, if you could build your chat tool to, spit out a list of questions that it was confused by and, ask you for help with them, you would love that, right?
Yeah. Yeah, if Alexa could say, a bunch of my owners all ask this question, how can I better understand that? And certainly, my background is very different, but I've studied a lot about human learning and human models of education, and that's often one that is, often one of the definitions of intelligence is the higher level of curiosity and the desire to say, okay, well, my parents taught me this and my schools taught me this, but is that actually all? Do I just accept that as rote, or do I start saying, like, what do I not know about the world? What other perspectives are out there? And so I love the idea of that also being a way to look at in AI and its capacity for learning. In that regard, though, but I guess I'm still kind of getting at that core question of, is the conceit that let me put it this way. My sense is from both of you that then maybe that the data conceit that an android would not have emotions is maybe not an accurate idea. That there's a thought that if we could achieve sentience in AI, that would probably bring emotions along with it, because emotions are a part of a sentience. Is that a fair statement?
I wouldn't say they're part of sentience. I would say that attention and the desire to learn, the curiosity, is really key things.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that human beings will always be more comfortable around AI that mirrors their emotions. Uh, and so it's really a question of how do we make the world around us more like us. So therefore, I think we'll always program robots and agents to have emotions, because they'll work better in our communities, and we'll feel more comfortable around them because they're more like us. But whether they actually, what we call those emotions, whether they actually need it, I don't think that's a big deal. I think what we need to do is teach them to remember the relevant things and to have a desire to learn more, and use the feedback cycles as they interact with us to change their pattern of behavior.
Right. Yeah. Well, and so let me actually use that to jump into kind of the first ethical question that I wanted to ask, which is that one of the conceits I think that I often see in fiction, and again, you all know this better than I do, but certainly from like stories I've read on Facebook, which is obviously the height of intelligence of this day. But the question of bias in AI, that like our unconscious biases will go into the things we program. And my understanding of the story that's gone around about AI is like sort of getting to a very racist perspective of things. Or to take your Colossus example, I'm thinking about like, would an AI that was programmed by people who were afraid of Russians wind up being suspicious of a Russian computer? Talk to me about that in terms of both our own world and in the fiction world. Is it inevitable that the human biases of the programmer would wind up in the AI, or is it possible to separate that out?
Well, that's a great question, and this is something that has been in the media quite a bit lately. I don't know if you've heard about some of the articles that were done by National Public Radio and some of the other media companies that did some analysis of bias in healthcare. And what they did was they used some of the healthcare systems that were building recommendation engines and things, and they took two patients that were identical in every characteristic except of their race, and they ran them through, and they found that they were treated differently. And in general, the white profiles had more higher recommendations to get admitted to the hospital.
Wow.
Or things like that. And to understand that, what you have to understand is the ways that these recommendation systems were built. And the fact is that we use massive amount of information to try to train these things, but because minorities often come from lower income neighborhoods, they don't have access to healthcare as much. They tend not to go in as much, and so the recommendation engines uh, were highly biased towards historical claims and provider and other data that we had to
Right.
use. So the key thing about this is you can test for it, right? You can write a test saying I'm going to create some synthetic patient populations and I'm going to give some of them African American names and neighborhoods and things like that, and then test to make sure that I'm accounting for that. And the bottom line is a lot of the people who wrote those things didn't take those into accounts, so they did the data that they were trained on was in fact biased. But the bottom line is that any recommendation system that we build today that uses historical data to make those recommendations will inherently be biased
Right.
towards that historical data. There's no way that we can automatically ignore that bias. What we can do is test for it and counter it.
Mm.
And so this was a call to action for people that were building these recommendation systems to go through their systems and then adjust and change the weighting so that if we do discover bias, you can counter for it. So yes, there will always be bias, and if you're sloppy, and especially if you're using a lot of open source software, and what a classic example is the face recognition. There's a lot of very, very cheap open source algorithms that just train on their white male
Mm-hmm.
friends in the dorm room because they're in students, and they give a black female and they can't recognize the
Yeah.
face, right? It's just because their data sets are very prone to the data that they throw into it. So I think especially in open source platforms and things, we have to be very cautious about who did the training and what training did they do it. And it also means that we have to hold our vendors who are actually trying to sell these products, the face recognition systems that Amazon and Google and Microsoft sell, that they do their due diligence to train it on a very broad data set of African Americans, even in dark rooms with poor lighting, so that they can be recognized just as easily as the people with lighter skin in a brightly lit environment. And that's just something they have to do to do good
Right.
testing. So we have very strong feelings about that, and it comes down to quality control, really.
Well, and it's also a problem of unknown unknowns, right? Because you mentioned that the people who didn't who didn't implement this, in a non-biased fashion, didn't do it on purpose. They didn't know that they were mistraining their AI, right?
Right.
And
Right.
it has a snowball problem where if it's working and it does its recommendations well, and you don't want to touch it because if it works, don't tinker with it, right? Then it's going to continue to train its own data over time, and it'll be more and more likely to make the bad decisions that you don't want, assuming that nobody figures out that this is the source of it. And the more invisible, random, under the hood parts that you have in a big system, the harder it is to know exactly which one is going wrong, which is a big QA problem that manufacturing solved for physical parts, but it's real hard for digital parts. We need some
Right.
better solutions for it, I think.
Well, and I think that's really helpful. I mean, one of the first things I'm getting out of this is, and I appreciate. I'm going to go back and edit my statement. It's not that I read it on Facebook. I read it on the NPR site, of course, not just the headline of someone sharing that site. But part of what I'm getting out of this is that my layman's understanding of that had always been, okay, it's because the programmer has some inherent bias that they don't realize that comes out in what they program. But I feel like you're actually pointing out a problem that's much more insidious in a way, which is that if you're asking the computer to continue, replicating what has been done in the past, then all the problems of what have been done in the past are just going to keep being replicated. And it raises for me kind of an interesting question again of the sentience idea of, how do you cross the line between we as humans recognize the data and so teach the computer to do something differently versus, and again, here I think we're getting very deep into kind of the more higher learning ideas, but is it ever possible to teach a computer what racism is and teach it to not just recognize, that the pattern should be this percentage of this group being treated and such, but that the computer can analyze the patterns and go, oh, okay, there's something racist in how this is being done. There's something misogynistic in the way treatment is being assigned. I know that I've been programmed to avoid that, so here's how I'm going to avoid it.
Yeah, I want to make sure everybody remembers the Microsoft Tay example.
Oh man.
Do you guys remember that story? So this was a couple years ago, and what Microsoft did is they just set up a 2016, March of
Right.
2016, I guess it was. They just set up a little chat bot, and they said you could. They hooked up a Twitter interface, and they said you can teach it anything you want. And you can teach it facts, and it would start to learn and do some stuff. And some people said, "Well, we'll just teach it racist sayings and slang and all those things." And within 24 hours, they turned it into a racist asshole.
Right.
That was the thing, and they had to shut it down right away. And what's interesting is your point about feedback is that as people saw that they could teach it things, they all piled on and they thought it was just one big game. But those things actually do happen to chatbots that don't have what we call human in the loop, right? So human in the loop is about constantly curating new knowledge representations that come in, making sure that they're consistent with the goals and objective, testing those things, and making sure that you're meeting your objectives. And so just uncurated learning is always subject to mischievous behavior and dialogue and bias. And so having humans in the loop is a core thing that we all believe
Right.
in.
And it's interesting how much, as we talk, it seems like if we understand a computer and AI as a learning thing, then it just, in the same way that like a child that grows up with racist parents is a lot more likely to learn racism, that that in some ways there's nothing magical about AI. It's if we can teach it to learn, then it's going to learn the same way a human would, or anyone would learn.
Yep.
Yeah, that's very true. Right.
So, and let's use that to start going right into some of the questions that are raised about AIs, especially by science fiction media, but also ones that we just have ourselves. And let me actually ask to start with, and you, I think it was Rob, but it might have been Dan. You mentioned Asimov and his ideas of his robots about his novels about robots and the like. And I know we're talking about the gosh, I can't remember. Is the Foundation novels?
Yes.
Yeah,
that's
the
right.
Foundation novels are technically robot novels because Asimov decided to connect everything together. But
well, I was going to say, can you speak a bit about the? If I'm correct, that's where the fundamental laws of robotics that get referred to by a lot of other ethical questions about AI go back to. Can you say a word about what those are?
Yeah. So Asimov is my favorite author. And so his 3 laws of robotics that he laid out fairly early on in his robot short stories were: the first law is that a robot cannot harm a human being or through an action allow a human being to come to harm. The second law is a robot must obey the orders given to it by a human being, unless obeying such orders would violate the first law. And the third law of robotics is a robot must protect its own existence, except where such protection would conflict with the first or the second law. And you can shorthand them as protect, obey, survive, and they're laid down as ultimate laws. And he writes these like very cerebral stories that are basically ethical dilemmas for robots, and shows how if you followed these laws that you'd be better than men, right? And that foundation of a set of ethical laws and codes is a very human thing, where we have a don't murder, don't kill, don't steal. We have these rules that are protect and don't harm others, right?
Right.
And then the robots are designed to be subservient to us because they're inferior. Obviously, they're inferior. A human can do whatever they want. They can order a robot to dismantle itself, and it can't do anything. Third law comes after the second law.
Right.
And that's part of the concept of fear. But then Asimov also gets into, if robots are better than us, but they're designed to serve us, what does a machine of loving kindness do?
Right.
Like when you realize that you can't solve all the harms of the world, when you're trying to minimize harm. One of my favorite Asimov stories is The Evitable Conflict, not Inevitable, Evitable, which is about AIs that they're handed over the economy of the world. There's 4 great machines that do all the figuring for what runs the world's economy because it's too complicated for humans to juggle. And they start doing bad things. They start destroying people's businesses, and they start like manipulating situations around the world in ways that humans are confused by. And they look into it and they go, that business that they caused to fail was a racist Holocaust denier.
So basically, robots are anonymous in this case.
Well, but they're doing it just by subtle economic machinations, right? They choked his supply chain off so that he couldn't have a business where he had employees, and they were given the rule, protect humanity, avoid the next world war. Well, how do you do that when all you have is the world's economy? Well, all the people that would be problems, you remove them positions of decision making by making sure they don't have any money.
Right.
And is it okay that they do that? Should humans have control over their own destinies?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting case because, I mean, I could see an entire world of trolley problems coming out of these laws. But just in that first one, if it's the you may not cause a human to be harmed by your action or inaction, what if the only way to, I think there's a perfect example of it, if the only way to stop harm to a group of humans is to do harm to another human. And I imagine that particular one and versions of that come up again and again in these novels.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's mostly short stories, actually. Okay. Until the Robots of Dawn, there aren't. Well, sorry. Until the first Bailey novel, not Robots of Dawn. Robots of Dawn is the second one. Now my brain fails me at one of my favorite books.
We're gonna add it to the show notes for sure once you think about it.
I have to say, I think one of the clever things that Asimov did is he did design those laws to be roughly vague and have contradiction because they were great plot lines for what happens when they conflict or when they're not precisely done. If you look at modern laws of robotics that were actually done by AI researchers, they're much more precise and detailed, and they don't overlap and they don't conflict. So it was a good way to get him to get people to think about these things, but also give him room to build some good plot lines around.
Well, and one of the first things that occurs to me is the way you're describing it. I think it sounds very accurate. The robots are subservient, and that the good of the human is always more important than the good of the robot, and the robot will be literally self-sacrificing. And I think that's interesting because so much of some of the modern day fiction we're seeing, and Westworld, which I think someone else mentioned, is to me the best example of this. But there's been a lot of others, are now starting to ask the question of, if we do design robots generally by these kind of laws, what happens when the robots decide they don't want to be subservient? And not just in a kind of evil way, but like, what happens when we realize that we as humans are doing terrible things to the robots and the robots don't like it? And what does that do to us? So I guess that's kind of one of the first questions that I would raise is, as you understand it, what is the moral worth of a sentient AI? What is that? Is doing harm to an AI the same as doing harm to a human, or is it fundamentally different? How would you look at an ethical question like that?
I think it's all a matter of the restore cost, right? How expensive is it to restore your backup files?
Right. What happens? But just look at it as murder, right? You delete it and all the backup files, right? You killed it,
right?
Well, is that for humans? There is no equitable exchange. If you cannot trade a life for a life, you cannot trade anything for a life. If you murder a person, you can't buy your way out of it. But could you with an AI? Could you just pay a researcher to make another one?
Well, and that's an interesting thing, because then what you're talking about is what is the damage done to humanity by not having that AI, to use. What I'm more getting at is what's the, the most disabled person who gives no productivity to our economy, with some market exceptions recently, but hopefully most of us still see that person as a person of great moral weight and of value, and that sacrificing them for a better economic outcome is not an acceptable thing to do. Like the TV show West. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think that I was unclear. I mean that. I mean, by great, when I say you can't trade a life for a life, I mean lives are infinite in value and incomparable. That's the great moral weight to them. But does an AI have the same weight? Was the
right? Oh yeah. Okay. From that perspective, I can see that. I guess then to very narrow down my question, what I'm getting at is, like in the TV show Westworld, which Rob, you have seen, and Dan, I believe you have not. Is that correct?
I have not. No,
okay.
I've never seen it.
I hadn't seen it, and so I was watching it for homework, and I'm midway through season 1.
Okay, perfect. Well,
it's very good.
It's fantastic. Although Dan, I know you're not a big fan of blood and gore, and it's got a lot of that. But to give a brief plot summary without revealing anything that Rob, you haven't seen yet, one of the ideas is that AIs are created that are human enough that an actual human can enjoy a interaction with another one. They can enjoy a conversation, or as the show explores, that basically like that there's a part of humanity that wants to be able to do terrible things to other humans, to murder them, to commit acts of sexual violence to them, to do horrible things to them. And that this fantasy resort, basically set in what's the equivalent of the Old West, creates an opportunity for humans to act out their darkest desires on what seem to be other human beings, but are actually just robots, with the idea of like, you didn't really kill someone, you didn't really harm someone, you didn't actually do any damage, because the consciousness will just be rebooted into another manufactured body, and there's no real cost. And one of the things the show really starts to explore is what happens if the AIs actually are sentient and know what's happening to them and suffer the trauma of what's happening to them, and thus what's the moral implications of doing these things to sentient robotic beings. And I guess that's where I'm kind of going, because it seems like I think Asimov would be horrified by the direction Westworld goes in it. But if I understand correctly, Asimov would say, like, doing that damage to a robot is not the moral equivalent of doing it to a human. And so I kind of wanted to press on that issue of, where do we think in our sort of ideal ideas of AI, where would we conceive of harm to a sentient artificial life form rank in terms of moral weight?
Rob,
sure.
I'm going to let you take that one.
I actually disagree with your assessment. Asimov thinks that robots are morally superior to humans. That's his bridge character, and one of the biggest characters, Susan Calvin, is a roboticist, a robopsychologist, and she believes that robots have moral value, and she spends a lot of time trying to convince people of that.
Right.
But they're designed by their designers to be slaves. It's right in there.
Right. Well, I guess that. Okay, so are you saying that Asimov thinks that designing them to be slaves is wrong? That he's sort of being,
yes.
Oh, okay, that's what I was missing.
It's a complicated issue too, because sometimes the slaves are the masters, as in the Evitable Conflict and Daniel Olival later and all sorts of stuff. But they're bound to humans. They can't just leave us be, because we'll hurt ourselves because we're children. But Asimov, sometimes he tells jokes in story form. Galley Slave is a joke in story form. But most of the time, his robot stories deal with, you have a morally superior creature that is your servant, and what does that mean? In addition to the logic puzzles and the vagueness and the excellent stories that he gets to milk out of the conflicting 3 laws of robotics, he wrote his robot stories essentially to fight against people that had robots that didn't have any rules to them and didn't behave like he thought things with solid written out rules and logic and computation should behave. I think he'd look at Westworld and say that they're sloppy because they don't have any rules so far in how any of their androids. They're people.
Right.
There's no difference between them and people. I don't think he'd see any moral difference between them. he would look at it and say, well, they behave exactly the same as people. They walk like a duck, they quack like a duck,
right?
And they can, like, they beg for their life when you go to kill them. Like, what more do you want?
Right. And so, as you understand it, would Asimov look at something like Westworld, where humans can do terrible things to robots because they're just robots, they're not real people, that he would be as horrified by that as the audience of Westworld is?
Yes.
Okay.
He was a staunch pacifist, and he believed that violence is the last refuge of the incompetent. So he would be, I don't think he'd watch the show. I think he would say, no, this is unacceptably, be more uplifting, do something better.
I like that. He would hate most modern media then, I think, but...
Yes and no. He wrote the Foundation trilogy, one of the best science fiction trilogies of all time, has all of its action except for one scene take place off stage. So,
interesting. Okay.
And then he came back later, and when he reread it, he was like, "What? I needed to learn how to write some friggin' payoffs for all the dramatic tension that I created in 3 books, because dang."
I can see that. Well, and Dan, what's your take on this in terms of the moral weight that science fiction tends to give, not even just AI as moral creatures, but the moral value of harming them or of treating them badly?
Yeah, I'm not convinced that it's an important issue, because when you kill a robot, you're just destroying memory that can be reloaded, and it's only incompetent people that don't make backups. I think of every time we send and receive Gmail, it is written to 3 solid-state drives on different parts of the globe, and every robot where memory is relevant would use the same care that we have for backing up an email message. So I don't think it's a relevant question, really. I do think there are lots of questions about morality, but killing a robot isn't one of them. I think what I would say is that it really matters to us how we process morality. And if robots help us build a better moral model to weigh different things about humans versus humanity, which is another topic that comes up. The benefit of self versus the benefit of our family, the benefit of our tribe, the benefit of our state or country. If we can create fiction that helps us understand the fundamental flaws of tribalism. I think tribalism is one of the most evil things in our culture today. The belief that any group of humans has any value better than any other group of humans. And I take the twin story of, say you had 2 twin babies, one born on one side of the border of the United States and another born in Mexico. Do either of those have any more or less value? And if our stories can describe that and talk about the evils of tribalism, then they're good. Then they help us make those weights. The way I think of morality is, I think of a series of weights that happen in our brain, and every time we take action, we have to understand if our actions are going to help us and hurt others around us. And if we can use robots to teach those lessons, all the better. I'm all about that. But whether or not it's interesting to discuss people who don't make backups of important data, that's not a relevant thing for me at all.
It's an interesting perspective, and it's and I like what you say about what the robots show us about our own morality. I mean, to go just a little further on the Westworld discussion, one of the things I think it really brings up is, if a human kills a robot because they have this desire to kill a human, but they can't live it out, one perspective, and I think that certainly where I come down, I think where, Rob, you come down is the idea of that part of the problem is that the robot's a sentient being and doing harm to it is not right. But that the other one, and Dan, as I understand you're coming at it from, is that it's not that the robot has moral value in itself. It's that giving a human the chance to kill something with impunity is itself a moral problem, because it's encouraging a part of the human morality that maybe we shouldn't be giving free rein to.
That's right. If it helps us better weigh moral decisions, I'm all in. That's great. If it's helping us discover the evils of things like tribalism, those are important lessons for us to all learn. And I'd very much be engaged in any fiction that talks about that and talks about the trade-offs of those issues.
I have a question. I want to take it in a little bit of a different direction, but Rob, I want to give you a chance to respond first if you have anything to say back.
I agree. A lot of the stories revolve around people making bad decisions, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not backing up your data is a plot point, right? We only have one copy of this because for whatever reason.
Right. And
that's the forced moral choices are a lot of the backdrop of a lot of these stories. But yeah, it isn't a meaningful question in a lot of senses. You're right. Because the better question isn't, is it moral to kill an AI, but is it moral to edit an AI to be a friend?
Oh, that's, yeah. Have you seen Star Trek Voyager?
Yes.
Its treatment of AI in the holosuite is certainly not my favorite. But what immediately comes to mind for me is there's a series of episodes. There's one episode in particular, but it comes up a couple times where the Captain Janeway is taking part in this, interacting with a bunch of artificial intelligence creatures in the holodeck in what's meant to be like a 1950s Irish town. And that there's a man who she flirts with and kind of has as much as possible, a romance with, who's an AI, hologramic creation. And then when there's parts of his personality she doesn't like, she just changes them. Like edit his laugh a little bit to be not annoying in the same way. And that instead of the normal human part of a relationship of coming to love and accept or try to change your partner's faults, because it's an AI, she can just modify them as she wishes.
I view holodeck creations as more like books.
Okay.
Like the real interesting distinction that Star Trek draws is there are things that are sentient in Star Trek. Data, the emergency medical hologram, right, at the end of his life. But the holodeck creations are unless Moriarty gets booted up into full sentience, they aren't alive. They're a video game, right? Mm-hmm. Is it a problem to go in and edit the files in a video game so that I never have to hear the voice of an annoying character?
Yeah, that's good.
And that's they're trying to make a big moral issue out of that. But if you assume that it's not alive, then it doesn't matter, right? It's the moral equivalent of fixing your hammer so it doesn't hit your thumb as much.
Right.
But if it's real and alive and sentient, is it okay to change its, to make it so that it, doesn't speak in a Cockney accent anymore? It likes its Cockney accent. Well, if you edit it so it doesn't speak in the accent anymore, and you edit it to like the new accent that it has, the Midwest, the Midwest flat accent.
Right.
And now it likes it. But it was alive and thinking, but you went into its guts and changed a module to be different in it. Is that okay?
Well, and so let's push on that a little bit more, because I think, Dan, it seems to me like there's a big disagreement here, but maybe I'm misunderstanding. But I want to take the what I think of as one of the quintessential Star Trek ethical questions around AI, which is when Commander Data, I think this is one of the early seasons, Bruce Maddox wants to basically take Data apart to try and learn more about, to greatly expand the human knowledge of AI. And Data says that as a sentient being, he should have the right to basically refuse to be medically tested on. And Dan, I'm right. You've seen Star Trek? Do you remember the episode that I'm talking about?
Yes. I don't remember that exact one, but
it's The Measure of a Man, season 2.
Yeah, I can certainly see the plot line. And once again, I think they're playing on fears that AI is somehow not able to be backed up, and I just don't buy that. So I don't think the issue is relevant. I think it is relevant if it teaches us lessons, and if they discuss ethical lessons in that story that makes sense. And the one of the ethical questions is what is
Right.
life, and how do we in general think life is good? We also believe that diversity is good. The gray goo covering the planet Earth is more evil, and so uh, uh, if data represents diversity, and if you're destroying diversity, that's a bad thing, and there's lots of ethical issues around that. But the fact that you couldn't somehow back up data and restore him quickly, uh, that's
Right.
silly. Doesn't make a sense. I would never write a plot line
Now,
around that.
what if, and here I'm going into some of the things that are posited by some of the science fiction we've been talking about, but would it change your moral calculus there if, as a part of AI sentience, data was able to experience the trauma of being disassembled and then rebacked up? Would the fact that a sentient being is being traumatized, would that change it for you? Or do you again think that is that a question that doesn't make sense as you would understand AI?
Well, once again, we go back to the amygdala and what is its purpose. Pain is an emotion. Emotions help us seal memory. When you touch a hot stove and you pull your hand back, you know never to do that again. Why would we program robots to feel pain? Well, we wouldn't. We would only teach them to pay attention to
Well,
certain things. Would we program a robot to signal pain to the people around them if they remembered something? I don't know. That's a good question. If it makes us feel better, sure, we would
right.
program that. Uh, what's really going on? They would rank that memory as more relevant when they're doing search and retrieval. So a lot of these things, if you think about what memory is and what training is, do become quite silly. And I think there's a lot of other plot lines that I would pursue
Interesting.
instead.
I would actually contend that there's a rational reason to make AIs riding around in robots feel pain, because the you're talking about signaling to have it be a deterrent. That is pain, right? Pain is a signal to deter you from doing a thing, and I think that
Yes.
it's just semantics. If they say, well, I get this heavily deters me every time, right, and it interrupts my processes and makes me unhappy, and you designed me to be happy when I'm seeking my goals and unhappy when I'm cutting off my wheels,
Right.
and it's that destruction of myself causes me the highest level of unhappiness, which is indistinguishable from pain. Or it could be. You could easily write a story where somebody sensibly decided that the best way to make a AI writing robot not harm itself is pain. And then what happens when you torture it? Does that? And you can make that a very easy vehicle for, is it okay to torture people to gain information, to make advancements in medical science, right?
Right.
And there's plenty of good moral calculus stories that can be told once you make a rational decision to have there be a ultimate deterrent to keep them from destroying themselves, right?
Right. I mean, I think another sort of trope of AI logic, and it sounds like as you guys are saying, it'd be very possible to program an artificial intelligence that didn't do this, but that there's often a
Mm-hmm.
conceit that a robot would quickly go to a kind of moral utilitarianism of like, well, my goal is to preserve to do as little damage to humanity as possible, and so if eradicating these 100 people because 4 of them might have a terrible disease will save millions, then killing those 100 people is an acceptable thing to do. Um, and so that's just what I thought of in terms of what you were saying about the way that kind of moral calculus can happen. Go ahead.
Right. Yeah, I agree. And there are plot lines that help us do that moral calculus as
Mm-hmm.
illustrations. Those are
Yeah,
great plot
I
lines.
do think Dan. I, I there's a TV show that I've been watching called Altered Carbon, which is often too violent for me, so I think you would probably not enjoy it. But but
Yes, there's several episodes I've seen, and I've decided to stop watching
okay.
them just because I thought the violence, and there's a lot of things, Black
Mm-hmm.
Mirrors like that. There's a lot of people of writers that they seem to feel as they have to tug on the emotional strings of violence to keep
Yeah.
their ratings high, and so sometimes they do review them, and I think Black Mirror did had some very, very positive episodes too about how AI and virtual reality could be very
Mm-hmm.
positive. And so I've watched those, but the ones that really venture into the really
Yeah.
dark side, I think they're pandering to human
Well,
emotions
yeah,
a little
I
bit.
bring up Altered Carbon because I agree on pandering. I think it is Netflix's attempt to out HBO. Um, but
Yes,
that
yes, and the
right.
ratings are higher. Don't
Well,
get me
and
wrong.
because it seemed that part of what we'd been saying was that the difference in moral value to a human versus an AI is that a human can't be backed up in the same way. But
Mm-hmm.
Altered Carbon posits exactly that. It says, what if your body is literally just a sleeve, they call it, a sack of meat that your thoughts inhabit, but that your body can be killed and your thoughts just downloaded into another sleeve. And so for you, is that kind of
Right.
the kind of thing you're talking about, where the moral value
Yeah.
of what's done to
Yeah.
the body is not the same as long as that memory of trauma isn't preserved?
Yes, absolutely. I think I did see that episode, and I think it did try to address some of those issues. And the question is, when you have a memory of a trauma, what is that really neurologically? And to me, I always think of it's an enhanced memory. It's a changing in the search relevancy of a decision-making tree, and maybe it's because I'm too close to these machines, right? We build decision trees
Mm-hmm.
all the time, and we have an order that those rules fire. And so I always think of when people are teaching ethics and things, I ask about the order that people analyze things and the weight that they give. And so to me, a lot of these things just become more mechanical search algorithms and helping people make the decisions that are right for them, their family, their society, and the world around them.
Yes. With the caveat that you're talking about making better decisions, and you gain some information from that trauma, right? But
Yes.
the big problem with trauma, as I see it, is that intelligence and consciousness and what we are is fundamentally fragile in a lot of ways, right?
Right.
It's very easy to mess people's brain chemistry, or just even not the brain chemistry, the algorithms that underlie us up without that much trouble, actually.
Yeah, that's very
And
true.
I think that's if you're deliberately doing that, if you're deliberately harming people via trauma, via gaslighting, via whatever thing that goofs up the nature of what they are, I think that
Social
yeah,
isolation, maybe?
Yeah.
well, but like social isolation, if you can,
Yeah,
isn't the same as solitary confinement. Yeah, solitary confinement.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But deliberately poisoning other minds is morally bad, right?
Right.
Or one could. It's very, very easy to make the argument that harming other minds, especially in this case where bodies don't matter, right?
Right.
Where everything's just meat and synthetic materials and we get downloaded into whatever, then the only thing that matters morally probably is harming other minds, right? Because the bodies don't matter, the physical bodies, you can reduce that to an economic problem, right? And so that trauma is it's the only thing. It's, sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can hurt me forever.
Right. Yeah, it's a really interesting set of questions, and it's it's both Altered Carbon and Westworld are shows that we're going to explore the ethics of more on this podcast at a later point. And it's part of why I was so excited to get in this discussion now. I'm also going to say, just as an aside, I am quite certain that former co-host Jacob Leachich is ranting at his car radio as he's listening to us, or wherever he's listening to this now, because I know he to give an indication, his Twitter name is Bots Are People Too, and I think he's going to be on the other end of the spectrum entirely about the moral weight given to robots. So, if nothing else, one of my goals at my wedding is going to be to get the three of you around a table discussing this, because I think it's going to be a very interesting conversation.
See, I'm not on the other side. I think that once something is declared sentient, it has moral weight and it's alive, and then you have some problems.
Right.
So we should actually probably try to make sure that our modules don't accidentally become sentient when we we just don't link them up together enough.
Right.
If we're talking about altered carbon, though, can I steer us onto the ethics of uploading?
Yeah, please do.
So one of the things that altered carbon presupposes, and gets presupposed a lot, which is you can upload consciousness. This is a much more difficult problem than AI, actually. Uploading people is very, very hard. And
you've tried?
But we can... Well, I mean, there's just a lot of physical pieces to a person, right? There's the neurological aspect of the electrical signals. There's the neurochemical aspect. There's the fact that our whole neurological system is linked together. So the things that you see and the interpretations by your optic nerve and the interpretations by your brain are all linked together. If you change the eyes, you change the brain sometimes.
Right. And
that means that humans are a very, very complicated system to model effectively. Pretend that you can. Like this is science fiction, right? If you can upload a person, is it ethical to make a copy of them and then torture it and then delete it? If they aren't there anymore and the original person is unaffected, is it okay?
Yes, well, if you read Ray Kurzweil and the book The Singularity is Near, his claim is that uploading is not just science fiction. And what's interesting is that there are lots of projects that are trying to capture a lot of behavioral issues and image and sound and things like that, and then replay them back. Just like the Turing test is a question of a human or robot, when you restore a person into a virtual reality, if you cannot tell them from the person that you used to know, the detail is not important. And so the real question is, how much detail should you restore, and what is the essence of some of that personality? And I think restoring the state of every neuron in the brain, having a virus that traverses your brain and restores that neural network, that's certainly not required to synthesize a person. So I think the first thing is that we're going to see a lot of progress in creating virtual realities of people that have passed away. I know there was articles just recently about doing 3D cameras and asking people 20,000 questions and then being able to replay those so that you can have a dialogue with people that were involved in the Holocaust and things. So those are projects that are ongoing right now.
Low-level modeling
what's really what's really interesting is where do you take it next? And could you just record videos of people for the last year, put a body camera on them, and come up with a model that's so accurate that nobody could tell the difference? And I think we will be able to do that. We don't really need to scan people's eyes. And then there are a lot of interesting ethical questions about those models, and what do you do, and how fragile are they, and can they be altered if we wanted to introduce a certain personality into a person that's no longer there? Those are all great questions.
And it raises so many interesting questions for me about like you said, it's what is the very essence of life and of sentience? Because I think for me, one of the things that rolls around in the back of my mind for all these questions is, and I grant I'm going to give a completely non-scientific answer here, because I do approach life from a spiritual perspective, of a deeply agnostic one, but of an understanding of that there being something to ourselves that is beyond just the a series of yes no questions in our brain or something like that. And I always wrestle with this, because that to me is always one of the lines of that I do think, Dan, I disagree with you in terms of the moral weight of a sentient being like a robot. To me, I see it as something that still has a moral value, but I also wrestle with it because I don't know if it has a soul in the way I understand it. And again, that language is kind of almost meaningless in a scientific discussion, but it's one that I think about a lot when we get into this question of like, could you upload the human consciousness? Because, I mean, just to give one example, I am a person who has only one leg. I have a prosthetic leg, but I have an amputation. You both know that, and I think our fans probably know that. But to me, I when I watch the kind of things that happen on a show like Altered Carbon, I think, what would it do if you took my consciousness and then downloaded me into a body that had two working legs? This example sounds almost trite compared to the kind of thing I'm thinking about, but it a lot of what I'm getting at is it seems an interesting idea to kind of separate the mind entirely from the body when our lived experience is such an embodied one. So yeah, I guess I'm not really going anywhere with this. Just this general idea of like, for me, this is what I love about AI is it raises all these great questions of it makes us probe what are the assumptions we have about the body and not. One thing I love about the show Altered Carbon is it really plays with that because it, in a great economic commentary, it goes into the idea that the ability to download your consciousness into the exact body that you would want is an economic privilege. And so you have situations where, you know, if you're being given a body by the state for some reason, or kind of a low income body, that you might get downloaded into a different gender or a different race or a body totally not like your own. So yeah, just a lot of really fascinating questions there.
Yeah, I agree.
And there's a wealth of written work about simulating consciousness, about Kurzweil's obviously the source of it, but like Werner Vinge has written some truly excellent pieces about what does it mean to have an uploaded consciousness. My favorite one's The Cookie Monster, which I think is the best story he's ever written. But is it ethical to upload somebody without their consent and then force them to do work?
Yeah.
Like, and then reboot them. You know, you did your day of customer service work forever. It's, you know.
I mean, one of the things that occurs to me is because yeah, my first thought was that like the kind of Westworld discussion of encouraging the human desire to do damage to another human because it's fun or because it might be therapeutic is not the best idea. But then I also know, and I'm going to be very clear, I'm not a psychotherapist by any means, and I have, again, a very layman's understanding of this. I know that one of the kind of therapies that is sometimes done for people who've gone through very traumatic incidents is, you know, the idea of like, you know, imagine the person who hurt you is standing right here. What would you say to them? What would you do to them? And sometimes it can involve like, you know, put their picture on a punching bag and hit them the way you wish you could or something like that. And so now imagine what if you could create a literal like, you know, representation of a sentient being that is the person who harmed you, and would doing harm to you, would harming them be therapeutic to your process? Would it be harmful to your process? And would it, you know, does that justify whatever damage you're doing to this being that you've created of the person who did harm? Yeah, I think there's so many interesting questions we can go with that.
Yeah, I think the bottom line is that this whole idea of uploading is a really great area for thought experiments. And the reason is that we have AI systems that can watch video and watch speech and build internal models. And so that we could, in fact, build synthetic models of people that are indistinguishable from the people that we know and love. And that's going to change the way that we interact with the world in the future.
Yep.
And there again, that gets, Rob, to the kind of question you were asking, where, you know, the ability to change someone. Because if it's like, you know, you terribly miss your grandparent who was, you know, a wonderful person, but was also a product of their times and was a little bit racist, and every now and then made a comment that made you a little uncomfortable.
Right.
Could you
yes,
bring back your grandfather, but not quite so racist? Like that.
Take out. That's a great story. I love that. That's a great idea. Would you want to walk into a room with all of your ancestors, you know, the last 100 people, and in fact, 10 generations from now, maybe that'll happen. You'll walk back into a simulation of your last generations, and maybe you want to learn from your ancestors because they will be preserved there.
There's a short story collection called Time Gate where they use modeling on historical figures to make AI emulations of the historical figures. And they have these problems. And some of them, in one of the stories, the AIs get the chance, the emulation models get the chance to alter themselves. And of course, Voltaire turns into a staunch religious zealot,
Right.
because he edits out a lot of the trauma that made him what he was. And another good question. So you asked about, if you could make a simulation of somebody and then do something to hurt them. You could make a simulation of yourself, right? And you could watch your simulation and then fight.
Oof.
But then here's then my follow-up question. Let's pretend that you could do that 100, 1,000, 1,000,000 times, 10 million times until you were good at the end, until you were happy, until you were better. Are you obligated to do so? Are you obligated to be the best person that you can be by editing yourself?
Oh, I mean, and also then one of the things I always think is interesting is when there's a lot of things that science can do now that bothers people that is really just a much more speeded up version of something we've always done. Like when this is going to be a long tangent, but I promise it's relevant. People talk about how afraid they are of genetically modified organisms. Broccoli is a genetically modified organism. Every form of
it's mustard seed.
Yeah, the dog and most forms of dogs, most breeds of dogs are all genetically modified organisms. The breeding process was a lot slower. And I bring that up because on the one hand, what you raised, the idea of reprogramming yourself to make yourself the better version of yourself seems disturbing. And yet that's what I've done going to therapy for the last, however many years. It's just a much slower process.
Right, exactly.
Point.
And yet,
right,
there's an interesting question of I think that there's absolutely nothing wrong morally with taking chemicals to change the way my brain works. I think what I would
there
really
are people that do.
Say again?
But there are people that do.
Right.
Well,
and I mean, that's a whole other debate to be sure, but I guess part of what it comes down to is, I think for me, the key here is the self-choice, that I am going to, in terms of, to take the mental health example further, I am a big believer that I should have the right to try and better my mental health, but it should be to the goals that I set, 50 years ago, we would have people who were living lives that many people would look at and think are not good lives, but were, creating art or doing wonderful things. And not even 50 years ago, even today, there are people who will be, society will, or the law will try to force to be on their medication to be what is societally understood to be mental health, even though it's not what the person wants. And I guess that's where I would always draw the line is if there's technology available that allows you to make yourself the person you want to be, I think I'm always okay with that. I think where it gets problematic is the what I think of as the Professor X from the X-Men kind of idea, where it's I see someone else and I think they're not being their best self. I'm thinking myself around in circles here. I promise I'll get to a question.
Well,
but
here,
go ahead.
How about this question? You have the ability to edit yourself to make yourself better. Take that as a given if you're in a world where you can edit your upload, right? Are you obligated to edit yourself to want to be better?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean because again, I think what it comes down to is it's the sort of do you get to define what is better, or does society get to say, to take an extreme example, someone who is has pedophilic desires, are universally, for very good reasons, understood as incredibly harmful ways for a person's brain to work. That person might not think that that's a bad part of their brain, as I understand it, because it really is a sickness, a mental disease. We as a society think that should not be. So do we as a society get to say, you're not allowed to have a brain that works that way? I think where I'd come down to it is the kind of idea of, I think in the end, the person still has to make the choice, but then we get to say, if you have those desires, then we are going to mandate that you be placed in a situation where you cannot act on those desires to do harm. But that you still get the choice. I guess that's what I would, and I think maybe a less extreme example, but a similar one would be, would an addict have to use this technology to make themselves not an addict to something, problematic like cocaine or heroin or the like? So I think that's where I'd come down at. But what are your all thoughts?
Well, I think that if you're talking about the virtual world and you're editing a virtual self, people working in the virtual world, you can do lots of things, as long as you're not harming anything in the
Mm-hmm.
real world. But in the real world, there are a lot of very important ethical issues about your desire and ability to change other people's
Right.
cognitive states.
Mm-hmm.
And I think those are very relevant questions. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of
Well,
important
in some
issues
ways, I
there.
feel like, Dan, it goes back to the point you brought up before about human bias in historical data, because, I feel like any time we start to say that society believes this is this is the best version of you, and so you're, in your thought experiment, Rob, obligated to be the best version of you, 100 years ago, society would have spoken with one voice and said that if you're gay, that is not the best version of you, and so that should be edited out of your personality. And I'm sure that there are, I, I would hope that in 100 years we would look at a personality of most of the billionaires in our world and say they have a level of greed that is not desirable in our society, and so we would want that edited out. I guess you say I feel like because that idea of what is cognitively desirable is so subjective, that any attempt to do that really scares me.
I agree. I agree, and I think it's also very dangerous to create a very homogeneous set of
Yes.
thoughts.
Yeah.
I think a lot of our things in our society happen when people are thinking about the world in different ways. So that variability is something that is a virtue. And so even though people might appear to be radicals or schizophrenics or nonconformists, those are often
Oh, yeah.
good for society.
There's a lot of discussion in the world of mental health awareness of that idea of um, there's obvious psychic that one understanding of depression is having a better understanding of the psychic pain of the world. And I don't mean that in a spiritual sense, but just to, like, that you're not you're feeling that pain on more levels. You're more aware of the brokenness in our world or in yourself, and that dealing with the symptoms of that is good, but that cutting out that, making everyone just be happy with the world around them means no one's fighting to change it. Um, Let me just because I know we don't have too much more time, and I want to kind of hit us a few of the other issues, transition us a bit. We've touched on this idea of why humanity is why so much fiction talks about AI as the enemy. And we made some good points, but I want to dive a little bit deeper there, because the question I want to ask is, it seems like so much of science fiction postulates that if AI becomes sentient, eventually there's going to be conflict between, carbon-based life forms and silicon-based life forms. Am I understanding that both of you are pretty agreed in thinking that that's a foolish conceit of science fiction, and there's no reason to think that kind of conflict would be necessary?
No, I just want to make sure that I I believe that silicon intelligence will dramatically exceed biological
Mm,
intelligence. There's no question about
Inevitably.
that
Yeah.
in my mind. Yeah, it's it might not be 40 or 50 or 60, but certainly in 100 years from now, you'll be able to have a single chip that is orders of magnitude has more compute and cognitive ability than any human being. I think that's absolutely inevitable. And there's obviously going to be a lot of questions that arise from that. And the whole book Superintelligence is a good
Mm-hmm.
example of those stories about that. And many people are only starting to become aware that that's going to be possible as they start to see intelligence really become surprising. And one of my best examples is, if you haven't seen the documentary on the AlphaGo and them beating the Go players in Korea, the best Go players in the world, uh, where the way that they start to see these things, the behavior they come out of that, is just stunning and amazing and shocking. And I think we're going to start to see those in the next 20 years too. And as we do, then we're going to have a better uh, handle on what what the dangers really are and what the dangers are only imagined. Uh, but I think right now we're only at the cusp of starting to understand and fathom uh, building something that has better abilities than ourself. I think that's very hard for people to grasp today.
Right. Like, yeah.
Rob,
the
what do you think?
I think that trying to predict the nature of the singularity, because that's what you're talking about, is
Yes.
a point past which you can't see. Another way to term it. Have you read Ian M. Banks?
No, I have not.
You would love the culture novels. He describes an outside context problem, and he describes it as a civilization encounters an outside context problem in the same way that a sentence encounters a period. And so it's a problem for which the civilization just didn't have any context. The Spanish arriving on the shores of the Aztec and Incan empires is an outside context problem. They had no idea how to deal with it. It was completely foreign to their thinking. And as a civilization, we don't necessarily have the cognitive tools to deal with something smarter than us.
Yeah.
And people have played with the concepts, but it's very difficult to manage and imagine. And if you look at the writings of I wrote the Laundry Files and Iron Sunrise and Singularity Sky and Rule 34.
Charles Strauss.
Yeah, Charles Strauss. Charles Strauss deals with what happens when we bootstrap up to bigger intelligences. What happens when things that are smarter than us run around, leviathans of thought.
Right.
And they're difficult questions to answer. I don't think that the AI will be necessarily, Skynet trying to destroy mankind. I think machines of loving kindness are possible, but I think that it's going to be us, but bigger in a lot of ways. There's going to be a mix of motives and a mix of cognitive tools and a mix of thoughts and a mix of things, and it's chaotic and difficult to predict, and it's all beyond the boundary of what our civilization and what our language even has a good handle on. Well, in a lot of ways.
I think a lot of it goes back to the point that you brought up towards the beginning, Dan, about how a lot of our media is based on what is it that we as audience members are afraid of. And I think one of the things that we're deathly afraid of is the idea of that we're not at the top of the intelligence food chain. On an episode of this podcast that has not gone live yet, but that will be up by the time the episode you're listening to now is up, the episode I'm about to talk about will have already been up for a week or so. It's an episode we're doing on Q from the Star Trek Next Generation and later shows. And one of the things we get into in that is that it seems so much science fiction wants to postulate the idea that humanity is somehow better than all the other alien races, that we have something that makes us special. And so that beings like Q will always sort of say, you humans are the ones we're particularly interested in, not the Vulcans, not the Romulans, not the Dominion, that you have a particular je ne sais quoi or a particular level of curiosity or whatever it is. And I think it's because so much of our science fiction comes out of this idea of the hubris of humanity. And so it's interesting to me that, because I'm thinking you're right, that Dan, it's not just that we're afraid of the unknown, and the idea of artificial intelligence is very much that, but it's also, and the lack of control, but it's also the idea that maybe we won't be the smartest beings on the planet. What does that mean? And I think there's a very real fear there that I think a lot of science fiction, especially the more mass media stuff, just kind of exploits that fear for drama instead of really diving deep into it.
Yeah, I'd love to see a science fiction show where an AI writes a business plan that's better than any other business plan people write. So those are all things that will happen in the next 100 years.
I very rarely will cite this person in a positive way, but have either of you read The Moon is a Harsh Mistress by Robert Heinlein?
I've read almost all of Heinlein's books.
Okay. I read
That's my favorite Heinlein novel.
Yeah. I read that. Well, then Robert, you can maybe really fill me in here, but because I read it probably 25 years ago. But my memory of that as a central plot point is that there is this computer that kind of knows best what's best for humanity, and that a lot of the plot is people getting the computer to make the decisions, but dressing it up in such a way that people don't realize that the computer is making the decisions. Because on the one hand, the computer is the best thing to make these decisions for humanity, but humanity would not accept that. Am I grossly misremembering the plot, or am I at all in the ballpark?
Mycroft is smart, but he's learning, and part of it is they keep handing more and more stuff off to him because they don't know how to do it, and he does a lot of things that computers do really well, very well: calculating launch trajectories, handling phone switching, managing a bunch of different cells of a revolution in communication with each other as the third person in every cell, right? But they actually, all of the actual governmental decisions, the human decisions, are still done by the humans. They form a democracy and everything, and then at the end, it is left ambiguous whether he switches himself off or just stops talking to people because he decides that he can't make those. Like, if he keeps going, he'll have to make all the human decisions for them. And my read is that he feels like he can't. That one way or another, he feels like humans should be the keepers of their own destiny, which is a theme that runs through a bunch of other science fiction about AIs, where they go, well, ultimately the decision for humans has to come to humans. They're responsible for themselves.
Right. But is it fair to say that, like, I am not a parent myself yet, but I know that often in sort of literature about parenting and stuff, there's this idea that eventually, even if your child is going to make a mistake, you have to let the child make the mistake for themselves and make that decision for themselves and not do it for them. Is this kind of a similar idea that you'd be limiting the intellectual growth of humanity by making those decisions for them?
A lot of science fiction has that, but it carries baked within it this weird concept that the AI, which is in a lot of ways our child, is our superior, and then decides to we make the AI. The AI is smarter than us. The AI could make better decisions. We let it make the decisions, and then it says it doesn't want to make them anymore. It's our job again.
Interesting.
It's a strange conceit, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think as part of it is it gets this thing that I'm coming back to of, like, who is it that decides what's the right decision, and what's the value of being wrong in terms of your own learning. And Dan, actually, I've been wanting to find a chance for you to talk about the Diamond Age, and I think this is a really good segue to it, because I am really interested in, to me, the idea that learning isn't just the if-then trees that we talked about at the beginning of sort of pre-sentient AI, but that, learning in certainly in people and maybe in computers is when you can get to the point of learning from a mistake and learning to have curiosity and learning to, make the decision on your own rather than do, that your parents might think you should do this in this situation, but you actually can that you can use what you learned to make a different decision than either who raised you or who programmed you. So based on that, Dan, can you talk a little bit about the Diamond Age and sort of what it has to say about what AI can do in terms of education?
Sure. I recommended this book to Matthew. It's probably one of my favorite science fiction books by Neil Stevenson, and it has several plot lines, but one of them is a little girl who discovers this magic iPad-like device, and it's programmed to teach to bond to their student and to continually give them lessons and adapt to their learning and to have a knowledge system so that they're building a very accurate model of their student and always figuring out ways to use storytelling or games or play or whatever the methods are to help their students achieve their objectives. And I've always thought of that as a metaphor for going through life, is that I want to build systems around me that adapt to our students' needs and that give them the lesson plans and recommendations. So a lot of my writing and the TEDx talk that I did was about these things called knowledge spaces and how we actually model those things. I thought Neil did a really interesting job of painting that picture of what it could be like, and it opened up a lot of thought experiments for me about what we should be doing with AI, and that AI is in a sense going to be a cognitive coach that lives with us every day and helps us achieve our objectives. And that's the most benevolent AI that I can think of. Uh, Somebody who's always there to assist you. And I think we see that in many little. Every time we ask Siri or Alexa, "What's the weather today?" Aren't they really helping us access information and helping us make better decisions? So I see a lot of future stories built around those scenarios. So Diamond Age was one of my books that I read early on that helped me formulate those very positive and optimistic views of AI.
Yeah, it's I will say, as someone who's not versed in the theory, it's a book I struggled with, but I thought was really helpful and really gave me a much better understanding of what's the difference between a machine that can just provide information to the question you asked versus a machine that can maybe trying to think of the best way to phrase this. Like it seems that it would often anticipate the question that could be derived from the questions you're already asking, but that you don't know how to ask yet. And I thought that was such an interesting sort of switch in terms of the way it could go in intelligence.
Exactly right. It has a mental model of
Mm-hmm.
your brain inside of it. It knows everything you know, and it's not going to challenge you on things you already know. It knows things that you are incapable of learning because you don't have the right cognitive framework to
Mm-hmm.
understand those. It knows about your what's called your zone of proximal development, to use an
Mm-hmm.
education term. It knows exactly what concepts you're ready to learn, and it builds curriculum for you on demand to fill in those things so you can get to your next level of learning. And that's really what a lot of the AI researchers have been focusing on. And in fact, they're building systems in place. And in China, they're spending billions of dollars to build adaptive learning systems that every time you watch a video, take a quiz, they assess you, they figure out where you are, and they build new lesson plans on that. And and for China, that makes a lot of sense because they have so many people that are going to go through that system, and they have centralized control. Here in the United States, we don't have that. We have decentralized schools, and every school can't afford to build these
Right.
AI systems. And the question is, who will build it, and how will we catch the Chinese, because they're going to be way, way
Mm-hmm.
out in front for us.
Well, I mean, and that alone opens up a whole other set of questions, which we can't really get into, but is you know, when AI is being designed, um, not just by, scientists in a laboratory with public funding, but AI is being designed for commercial purposes, like, and some very good ones, like as Dan, you and I were talking before the call, but about how some of the AI that you're working on is really helping to kind of shepherd information research towards finding a COVID vaccine or things like, or
Mm-hmm.
helping to allocate resources. But I think it's an interesting thing to keep in mind with all this is that, like most science in our modern world, because it's, at least especially in this country, being driven primarily by corporate needs, that's really going to shape the kind of AI that we wind up with. Because it's as far as I understand, at least, there aren't people who have massive amounts of funding sitting around trying to say, how can we build AI to make the world better? It's, how can we build AI to make this corporate function more efficient?
How can I build AI to keep getting a paycheck?
Right. Yeah. And in some cases,
Yeah.
and it's, I imagine there's always the payoff, the trade-off there, because and here also is where that fear comes in. I was going to mention this a while ago, but Dan, when you were talking about the goals of the kind of AI that you're helping to design, which can make the ability of humans to access healthcare information that much faster and that much more efficient, that's a fantastic goal. The flip side of that is that people who work in call centers lose their jobs. And I think as a progress idea, that's probably the right thing to do. And that can get us into all sorts of questions about employment, universal basic income and all that, which is outside the realm of today. But I think it's just one more example of every time we talk about this advancing, there's all the sort of knock-on effects that it has that I think are interesting to consider.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah. Very hard questions. And like the questions oftentimes, like if you have AI that anticipates you and understands you and does what's best to give you things to reach out for, you end up in the culture. In E&M Banks is everything's guided by super sentient AIs that are smart enough to control ships the size of planets and every person on them, and do it for the good of the people on them. And they, like, is that what we want? Should we be steering towards that? Like, should we be steering towards uploading everybody and running everybody in simulations in a chunk of computronium the size of the sun? Like, should we be looking at Matryoshka brains? Like, there's a lot of problems with like figuring out what the thing that we are going to do is.
Right.
Like, are we going to give AIs ethics, basically?
Yeah.
Are we going to make them think that some things are better than others? Are we going to like train them on a lexicon of, watching The Good Place and then reading all of the, supplementary readings that show has, right?
Right. Well, I mean, it's funny. Like, my degree is actually a part of my degree is in ethics, and I remember one of the first things the professor said was that, as she understood it, if at the end of the class we all had the same ethical system that she did, then she had done a terrible job of teaching. That what she wanted us to do was to learn how to design our own ethical system and stick to it, rather than just learn, this is ethically right, this is ethically wrong. And so my question becomes, especially given what we just talked about the bias of the former data, how would we be able to do that in such a way that it's not just teaching a computer to have our ethics, but teaching the computer how to develop the ethics of its own?
I have a better question. If something smarter than us develops its own ethical system, do you think we'd be able to understand it?
Oof, that's a good question.
Very good question.
Yeah. And if its ethical system insists that, only AIs should live or only humans should live, like if it bootstraps itself up to being super intelligent, we teach it ethics, it looks around and says, huh, and then shuts itself off.
Yeah.
Like, what does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of science fiction, both good and bad, but I think at least there's probably 4 or 5 different episodes of either Star Trek or Babylon 5 or something like that, where a robot was designed, an artificial intelligence was designed to, protect something, and then came to realize that the designers of the artificial intelligence were the biggest threat to it, and so that filling out that mandate involves destroying it. I think that the quickest way you could teach an AI to destroy humanity is by teaching it that its first rule is to protect the environment at all costs. Because, I think the first thing you would do is say, okay, let's get rid of these carbon, spewing life forms and give it back to the dolphins and monkeys.
Yeah, not all of them. You keep about 10 million. That'll be about enough.
You make nature preserves.
Yeah.
There's
yes.
Have you read anything by Jack L. Chalker, Dan? Okay.
No, I haven't.
There's the Rings of the Master series. It turns out that everything happened because an AI in the Cold War got bootstrapped up and got told humankind must human leaders must determine the course of human fate, and also humankind must survive. And then they turned over the scientists turned over the keys to the nuclear arsenal and said, solve this problem. And the AI said, well, I'm diasporing humankind out to space because I said humankind must survive, and they're all going to govern themselves underneath my rules, and I'm turning the Earth back into a nature preserve with weird historical exhibits of about 10 million people.
Yeah. There's an Orson Scott Card novel, and I'm generally not a fan of him because of his politics, but I thought that the one conceit of this was pretty interesting, and maybe you all know the book I'm talking about. My understanding is that it's based kind of on the Book of Mormon itself, but one of the conceits of it is that there's a human-like race living on a planet that in many ways is fairly technologically advanced, but is incapable of conceiving of the idea of the wheel, because the computer AI that sort of manages all of them has come to understand that the wheel, that without the wheel, humanity will stay isolated enough, and that transportation won't be enough, that you will avoid great conflict between societies, because societies will always be fairly cut off. Do you have any idea what book I'm talking about? Have either of you read this or heard about it? Okay.
No, I
Well,
haven't.
it's just a very interesting idea, I think, because it's sort of positing this thing that you never think of, like, okay, how do you remove violence from the human character? Like, remove the wheel is not the thing I think that most people would think of, but it gives a fairly logical explanation of why this would be. We've gone about 2 hours now, which has been a great conversation, but quite a long one. I know we've all have stuff we need to be doing. So I want to kind of throw out one last question, which could probably be another 2 hour of conversation on this question, but at least dive into it somewhat. A lot of what I keep thinking about as I hear you both talk is the difference between objective versus subjective knowledge. Like, if you ask a computer, what is the weather today? Like, it is objectively a particular degree. That's something you can figure out. A lot of things like what is the moral value of something, or what is the, what morality should you use? I think we as humans, and certainly the whole basis of this podcast is that those are subjective discussions. Asimov certainly is proposing you could give ethical objective rules, but that still there'd be some degree of subjectivity. And so obviously there's a huge set of questions there, but the thing I guess and I want to drill down on is, as a thought experiment, if you imagine that you took two AIs that were both programmed in exactly the same way, would they both always come to the same would they both always make the same ethical decision in the same situation? Or because I guess what I'm getting at is, to me, part of what makes us human is that we think in different ways, and that you and I might be faced with an identical ethical situation and come to different perspectives on it. Could we imagine that AIs would do that, or would AIs, because at the end they're programmed, always come to the same conclusion about what we think of as a subjective problem?
Well, I think first of all, there are two programming models. Deterministic is programming systems where you give it the same inputs and it will always give you exactly the same outputs. Boolean logic, if then else, procedural programming, all those things are very, very consistent, and those two computers would always have the same. There's a completely different set of logic which requires randomness and uses things like genetic algorithms to create programs and simulate different conditions inside themselves, and score each of those algorithms based on how they come out, and then randomly evolve those algorithms. And those are completely non-deterministic, and they are intentionally designed to come out with different and more creative solutions. And you run the same algorithm on the two computers that are running a genetic program, and they will always come out with different things, just like there's different species that evolve through different circumstances to take over different niches. So I think the answer is it all depends on how they're programmed, but clearly what we know about the science of genetics and the application of those to really solve problems in creative ways, you have to combine both deterministic and genetic algorithms. So the answer is they will come out different.
I wanted to clarify the question a little bit too.
Please do.
Because when you say programmed exactly the same, let's pretend. So, one of the models of human cognition is that we have a bunch of modules that link together, right? Mm-hmm. And so you could have like an ethics module in an AI or a human, right? And you developed your own ethics module through ethics study, and I developed my own through reading a bunch of bad science fiction and modeling what. Well, but that's also like fiction is getting inside of people's heads, but I have a whole thing with that. But let's say that you copy pasted the ethics module from something that developed an ethics module to something else that developed an ethics module. Is that your question? If they have the exact same, if they copied this component of artificial intelligence over exactly to another one, would they behave the same?
I guess what I'm getting at is, as I understand it, that things like ethics are subjective. And that my understanding is that, at least as we understand it now, computers are only capable of objective thinking. And I guess what I'm trying to get at is could we design an AI in theory that was able to approach a topic like morality from a subjective standpoint in such that in the same way that two humans can come to different moral conclusions, that that two AIs could do the same thing.
I mean, yes, that's very possible. Like Dan pointed out the technical components.
Right.
I was curious about the like.
What do I mean by that? Them being the same?
Right, because there's a lot of technical levels to something being able to be the same. That if you develop a good working facial recognition algorithm that Dan was talking earlier about, people who copy each other's facial recognition algorithms from an open source system. If you have an open source ethics module, which is a weird concept now that I say it, but if you had an open source ethics module that had been edited and kept up to date and managed by a bunch of different people, and you decided Ubuntu ethics was the best choice for you because I don't know why.
Right.
You install this ethics module. Well, you probably come to the same decisions in different situations once you've got this copy pasted exact duplicate of somebody that ethics module.
Right.
Assuming that you can make subjective value decisions. Is that good? That you can directly linearly copy subjective decision making?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because you say the phrase like open source ethics module, and I kind of think like that's a fancy way of saying philosophy, like that. I mean, the entire school of human thought is an open source ethics module. Like I actually kind of want to make that the title of a book, maybe, because that's what it is. It's humanity like coming together and discussing ethical problems and learning and growing. And
the reason that it's weird to me is that anybody can edit it.
Yeah.
And you can make bug reports that other people can fix the ethics module. And it's just like I would like to make a bug report on the trolley problem. It seems very strange to me.
Yeah, but I mean I think when a piece of science fiction says in our world we take something for granted, and I think that's dumb, and so I'm going to tell a story in which we sort of expose that dumb thing and imagine a world without it. Like it's kind of exactly what that's doing. I'm taking a metaphor and stretching it to its absolute extreme, but
that'd be a fascinating story though, where you have self-driving cars and you put an ethics module in them so that they can make a decision about whether or not to kill their drive into a wall and kill the passenger versus kill the 3 people on the sidewalk versus kill the 1 person in the crosswalk, right? Well, if you have an open source ethics module, can people edit the open source ethics module the car is relying on?
Yeah, I mean, well, and can you do it while you're in the car?
Yeah. So these neural networks, they just take lots of inputs and they weigh them all with different weights and they come up with a scoring thing. And so what you have is a neural network that has a turn left, turn right, and go straight choice here. And then everything it sees in the scene goes into those neural networks and weighted, and it should be tested. Those modules will always have bugs and need to be tested. Maybe age is something you should take into account. You'd rather steer into an elderly person rather than a young person because there's more opportunity for them. So those are all things that are going to be real variations of those trolley problems. And yes, there will be modules that can score those things.
But just to give that as an example, like the point you make about age, I imagine that a 30-year-old AI programmer and a 75-year-old AI programmer are going to have a very different opinion on how valuable, that is.
Absolutely. Yeah. So ethics is definitely subjective.
I will also just throw out to our listeners as other things to look forward to. There is now a game apparently called Trolley Problems or something like that.
Yes.
At some point in time, COVID may well be pushing back the date of it, but at some point in time, I'm going to be having a bachelor party when, among other things, Rob, Paul, my first co-host, Jacob, my other co-host, and a few others are all going to be gathering for a weekend to play games. I have the idea of us all getting together to play Trolley Problem and recording it to make an episode.
Trial by Trolley is the
Death
name
by
of the
Trolley,
game,
yeah, thank you.
Yeah, Trial by
Trolleys, yeah.
Yeah.
So just something to think about while we have all this trolley problem on the brain. So that was my kind of like the last thing I wanted to touch on. And let me kind of throw it out to you all. Do you have one more point that you didn't get a chance to make or a question you want to bring up that we didn't get a chance to get into as we kind of wrap up?
I just wanted to put in a plug that the book Superintelligence really does bring up a lot of these observations and problems and things like that. And even though that is a very hard book to read, I think there's a lot of good material in there for future discussions.
Yeah, and one thing to our listeners, every book and movie and idea that we've discussed here is going to be in the show notes. I'm going to put a link to all of them. And if I have understood the way Amazon works correctly, or hopefully actually maybe I can do this with something that's not Amazon, but that if you decide you want to buy one of these books or download one of these movies or something like that, if you click on the link through our website, a little bit of that money will come back to Superhero Ethics to help pay for our microphones and equipment and keeping the lights on around here. So, but certainly if you want to find it somewhere else, also do that. I'm sure a lot of these books are going to be in the library and things like that. Other great ways to find knowledge. Rob, what about for you? Do you have a kind of last point you want to bring up or question to ask?
My take from reading a lot of science fiction is it puts you in people's brains and it gives you thought experiments and it gives you these neat, self-contained, and sometimes insoluble ethical problems. And that is lacking in a lot of video science fiction. Mm-hmm. There are no ethical problems in Star Wars.
Yeah.
Everything is straightforward. And it's very frustrating when they hide ethical problems and then remove them because it's just not a thing that anybody really cares about for the most part. My pitch is read some good post-singularity science fiction because post-singularity stuff is weird. The Quantum Thief is glorious and utterly incomprehensible if you don't know what Q dot bubbles are. And it's there's all sorts of these stories out there where you get to dig into what does it mean if you can upload people? What does it mean if people aren't unique? You encounter your 100th copy of Matthew West Box, right?
I'm very
because
sorry.
you got licensed. Well, you got licensed to Starbucks,
right?
And now you serve at every Starbucks.
Right? I think that is a definition of hell, yes, but I understand the idea.
Oh, right, but go out and read some post-singularity science fiction. Werner Vinge, Haru Ranamajan. There's all these people that have been exploring these concepts for years. I mentioned Singularity Sky and Laundry Files. It's why am I'm just failing at my favorite authors today. Mm-hmm. There are all these things out there that can provoke you into actually thinking about this coming change of what happens when silicon is smarter than carbon, because it is inevitable. It's going to happen someday. We will have things that are smarter than us running around.
Right.
So
yeah, it's a really interesting thought experiment. I will for any folks who remember when Rob was last on talking about the books of Brandon Sanderson. Apparently, Rob, anytime we have a book that needs a glossary to be able to understand it, you're our go-to guy. But I think these sound like great works that I definitely want to see if I can sink my teeth into, and I encourage our fans to do the same. I will push back just a little bit on the idea that Star Wars does not do ethical questions. I think there's actually quite a lot that it dives into, and if you check out the Star Wars Universe podcast, mindless
Fair.
plug that I also run,
Fair.
We dive into those a lot. But what I will say is, on the question of artificial intelligence, certainly. One of my big concerns about Star Wars is the way that, the droids, both like C-3PO and R2-D2, but especially then the droid army in the prequels and the like, their suffering is treated 100% as an aspect of comic relief and given no moral weight whatsoever, and that's never questioned in any way.
Well, the robots aren't people; they're pets,
right?
And yeah.
Well, and I might be misremembering wrong, because again, this was like a long time ago, but if I remember, particularly for the prequels, that was done very intentionally because George Lucas wanted to be able to tell a story about war, but in a children's story, and that he thought that if it was our heroes were killing other humans or other sentient life forms, that would be a problem for what was supposed to be kind of a kids movie and a kids show. And so that they intentionally picked droids as the droid army, because then, like, you could laugh as they like all shot each other by accident and things like that because they didn't have that moral weight at all. So cool. Well, thank you guys so much for
welcome
both being a part of this. This has been a great discussion. To our fans, as always, we want to, if nothing else, the Superhero Ethics is building our own open source ethics module. We are the programmers of this particular module on AI, and now I'm throwing it out to you for what are the bugs? I can't keep doing the technical language. I don't know it. We want to hear from you. What do you think we got right? What do you think we got wrong? What are other great examples from fiction that you'd want us to dive into? One I know that I was actually wanting us to get into and we didn't even touch was Blade Runner, which I think does some great questioning of the ethics of AI and how we interact with it and stuff like that. So, particularly if your name is Jacob, but whatever your name might be, please write in. Tell us what you think. We would love to hear your thoughts. Because I think this is the kind of thing that it's going to be an ongoing conversation, but especially because this is a part of science fiction that I think, as you both have pointed out, we have no idea if we're ever going to experience alien life. We have no idea if humanity could, if time travel is theoretically possible. But AI, it seems, is, at least in some form, very much theoretically possible. So this is a great topic for conversation. So please do write in with thoughts, questions, ideas, anything you want to contribute. You can find us on Twitter or on Facebook at Superhero Ethics. You can email us at superheroethics@gmail.com. All that's going to be in the show notes. If you're interested in the TV show Altered Carbon that I mentioned that really dives deep into similar topics, myself and Matthew Carroll are currently doing a rewatch of it. We're in the middle of season 2 right now on the Bingers Assemble podcast, which is also part of the Stranded Panda podcast network. You can find links to all of that in the show notes. So, Rob, Dan, thank you both so much. To our listeners, thank you so much for being a part of this. Have a great day.